everybody. Welcome to the Singapore Mediation Lecture 2022. My name is Liana. I'm a member of the registry team at the Singapore Mediation Center, and just for today, I'm your MC as well for the event. It's a pleasure to have so many of you with us, both in person and virtually in Singapore and around the world. A warm welcome to the Honorable Justice Belinda Ang, Chairperson and Director of the Board of SMC, Professor Wang Gungwu of the National University of Singapore, Mr. Philip Fong, Managing Partner of Harry Elias Partnership, honorable judges, and all of our distinguished guests. Harry Elias Partnership is the sponsoring organizer of this event. We'd like to extend our sincerest appreciation for the support of SMC and all their contributions to the mediation landscape. Before we begin the event, there's a few housekeeping items I need to run through. So if you are intending to claim CPD points for this event, please remember to check in at the start, which presumably you've already done, and out again at the end with our team at the registration desk in the front. Please also be reminded to turn off or silence your phones now, please. All right, so without further ado, the topic for today's lecture is a historical perspective of dispute resolution in the region. What lessons can we draw for today? I would like to invite to the stage our panelists, starting with Mr. Francis Goh of Harry Elias Partnership. Mr. Goh is the partner and head of international arbitration and mediation at Harry Elias Partnership. He is an internationally certified mediator and mediation advocate with 30 years of experience in legal practice. Next up, I'd like to welcome to the stage Ms. Daphne Hong. Ms. Hong is concurrently the Solicitor-General and Director-General of the Attorney General's Chambers, International Affairs Division. Next up, let's welcome to the stage Professor Wang Gungwu, University Professor, National University of Singapore. Emeritus Professor, Australian National University. Professor Wang is a historian and has recently won the Singapore Literature Prize for his memoir, Home is Where We Are. And finally, I'd like to welcome Ms. Eunice Chua, CEO of the Financial Industry Disputes Resolution Center. All right, I'll hand over to Mr. Goh.
Thank you. Welcome, all of you who are here in person and for those who are joining us virtually from all around the world. Let's get right into the subject matter. Prof. Wang, thank you for joining us today. It has been said, in order to truly understand the present, you have first got to make sense of the past. So, Prof. Wang, on that note, perhaps you can share with us the beginnings about how the legal framework has been brought into our otherwise Asian culture. Over to you, Prof. Wang.
As clearly, I'm not qualified as a lawyer to talk to you about all the complications of modern mediation. But as a historian, I've always been very curious about how people resolve their problems in ancient times down to the present. And clearly, there's a basic pattern. For example, in our region, and I don't limit myself just to Singapore and the immediate neighbors, but let us say Southeast Asia to begin with. But we can't separate Southeast Asia from India on the one side and the China, East Asia on the other. They've been interacting with, all these people have been interacting with one another for millennia. But let us say that in terms of background, our region, the basic indigenous societies and so on have always been, you might say, the transformation from what have been hunter-gatherers into agrarian societies. In agrarian societies, of course, wherever they are, there are certain patterns which are clear, and that is that the agricultural society is fragmented into numerous villages, And in each village, there'll be dominant families and those families who work for them. And that's universal. And certainly in our part of the world, I think evidence from archaeology and history suggests that we're not that different, wherever we have agrarian societies. And in agrarian societies, of course, we essentially talk about very simple units in which a few families live in a small village. They share responsibility from some land which they cultivate, and there are, from time to time, disputes. And how they handle it, as far as we can tell, is from just between families. Heads of families sit down and talk. And usually they don't need mediators. They can resolve them. So two heads of families can sort things out. But when they can't, what do? Since they're all closely related, since they work together in a small village, they probably will have to find someone from the next village to come and help them, someone who's not directly involved, because everybody in the village is involved in some way or the other in a dispute. So they find someone from outside. That's, again, fairly universal pattern that we see evidence here and there of, nothing clearly recorded. And of course, these people don't keep records. They would do their work and settle something or not settle something. And if it's not resolved, however, we have to move up to a higher level. They may have to do that. But on the whole, agrarian societies are very simple. Their disputes are simple, and the people involved are people who work on the ground. They know what they're talking about. So the disputes are rarely serious because they all understand what the issues are. Whether you stole my cow or whether you've cultivated into my plot of land, all these things are fairly standard, and they usually are resolved fairly quickly. But of course, that pattern becomes more and more sophisticated as time goes on. The villages get bigger, small townships appear, and then you have trade between one township and another, and then the whole subject gets more and more complicated. But essentially, wherever these societies develop, however they develop, there is still normally the first instinct is to find somebody you know to resolve a dispute between you and your neighbors and so on. And that's normal, it's unofficial, it's entirely private, doesn't involve anybody except the people concerned. Until, of course, you have administrations, governments, states, and so on. That's another stage. But let me say that on the whole, societies right from the beginning are never what we imagined them to be. They're simple, but even from the very beginning, we find in almost every society a certain hierarchy. You might say differentiation of classes and so on. Simple one is between the richer and the poorer ones. That's always simpler. And the bigger families and the smaller families, there's size. And as in normal societies, the bigger families who bully the smaller ones, the richer ones who bully the poorer ones. These inequalities, natural inequalities in society, perpetuate all kinds of differences, all kinds of difficulties, in fact, which sometimes it's very difficult to mediate. How do you mediate between a rich man and a poor man when the resources are different? So even at the very simplest level, you come across all kinds of problems. And the poor man complains that the rich guy has been bullying him, and you come along and the rich guy pays you more, and you probably find in the verdict on his behalf, he pays you more. The poor guy can't afford it. I mean, these are, again, you can imagine it. So it happens all the time that we read stories in different ancient tales. They tell you such stories. And that's quite common and to be expected. Ancient societies are no more equal than ours are, and hierarchies are actually very, very severe. For example, for Southeast Asia, the basic, apart from the indigenous societies, which were fairly simple agrarian societies, when they acquired a kind of more sophisticated cultures, it really came from elsewhere. And the first layer of cultures brought to Southeast Asia, for example, all came from India. What might be called Indic civilization. And Indic civilization, from fairly early on, for reasons which are very complicated, there have been castes. They actually have very rigid definitions of hierarchy. The hierarchy, there are no ups and downs. You don't move up from one to the other. They are rigid. And how they are defined, very complicated, and I won't go into that. But there it is. Your Brahmins, your Kshatriyas, your merchant class, and your lower class, your Sudras. And that was already functioning in India. And within that kind of society, everybody knew his place. You do not have a dispute with somebody from a different caste. It's just not possible. You have a dispute within your caste, you can find somebody to mediate and solve the problems. But if you come from a Brahmin class and you're from a merchant class, you haven't got a chance with the Brahmin class. It doesn't work. I mean, it doesn't happen like that. So you need something else, and that didn't really occur. The societal, the social structures remained fairly rigid throughout, as far as we can tell, even down to the present. Not so bad now, but many efforts to try and resolve it, but you can see how difficult it is, how rigid those structures were. Now, Southeast Asia didn't have that at all. But when Southeast Asia was evolving and drawing upon Indic civilization for its civilizational values, the interesting thing is that they selected what they wanted, and they did not take everything. And while they took a lot of beautiful things from India, the sculpture, the art, the great stories of the Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita, and all that, Ramayana was very widely respected right round the Southeast Asian society. All of them loved them. And you can see from the architecture, the gods they worship, the various forms that Brahma was supposed to take, the Vishnu, Shiva, all of them, everything was taken. But the interesting thing is that the Southeast Asians did not take the caste system. So that itself is an indication of the fundamental nature of the indigenous societies rejected that particular kind of inequality. They had their own inequalities, but they rejected it. So they could select and leave that out. So their mediation, it was in a much more open hierarchical thing, not so rigid. So I thought it was very interesting that they took so much from India and we did not take the caste system. And the thing is, you can see that this was I'm talking about a period of influence of more than 1,200 to 1,300 years, maybe more. Could be even 1,500 years of Indic civilization being the main source of the civilizations, of the cultures of Southeast Asia. And then, but they did, as I said, they did not take the caste system. And what is interesting is that when we generally call it Hindu, but it's a very vague word, but the Indic social values that were taken into this region, when they were superseded by other things. For example, when Islam came, or where Chinese economic and business relations advanced into Southeast Asia, they brought in different set of conditions for trading purposes and so on. When the Muslims came, they also came as traders. Almost all the later comers were traders, whereas the Indic civilization, from the very beginning, went beyond trading. There were priests, there were teachers, and there were artists, sculptors, architects, and who helped them build all those fantastic monuments that we see around Southeast Asia. But with the later ones, the Chinese came mainly as traders. And similarly with the Muslims, the Arab and Persians who came with Islamic faith. In fact, the Islamic merchants who came were very often using Southeast Asia as a way to get to China. And whereas the Chinese traders were more or less trading in the region, the Muslim traders were actually trading to China and did extremely well out of it. So for the 1,000 years or so of that relationship, overlapped a bit with the Indian one. But what was interesting was the Indic civilization influence gradually faded away. Reasons are very complicated. I won't go into that. One of the reasons, of course, was the interesting thing was, one of the reasons was because Islam came from the north, coming from Persia, Afghanistan, from Central Asia, from the Turks and the Mongols who were Muslimized, who came into India as the Delhi Sultanate down to the Mughals, and so on. And they affected the Indians to some extent. And in a way, they drew away India's interest in Southeast Asia And India had to, the Indic civilization had to defend itself in a way, or find ways of dealing with the Islamic challenge to them in North India. So the Indic civilization was going through a change. In the meantime, the economic relations involving the Chinese and the Muslims influenced the region. But what was so interesting was that what happened on the maritime side was different from what happened on the mainland. On the maritime side, gradually, Islam took over from all the Hindu and Buddhist ideas that were in Southeast Asia among the Malays and Javanese and all the other Nusantara peoples. Islam gradually took over, even though they didn't take over entirely. Again, very interesting how the native people would select what they wanted. They took from Islam what they needed, but a lot of the Indian influences remained for quite a long time underneath it. So there were layers, as it were, one on the other. And similarly with the Chinese, what they took from the Chinese was their business instincts, their manufactures, their wonderful ceramic works, their silk, and so on. All these things were trading commodities which the Chinese used to exchange for the native products which they wanted. So for commercial purposes, they seem to work. And we don't have any records of any disputes that I can find. I mean, I don't know how they resolved it, but presumably they had an understanding of how to solve their trading problems. For some reason, neither side, neither the Southeast Asians or the Chinese, recorded much about disputes. Every now and then you find an anecdote like saying you swear before some god or something like that, or you might offer to someone to test his truth, whether he's telling the truth or not, with all kinds of tests which are like the King Solomon's wisdom kind of tests. You have little evidence, stories like that, but how true they are, I have no idea. So I won't suggest that that's the way out. But anyway, the interesting thing is that they traded for centuries, and we don't have any records of any need for serious mediation at that trading level. They seem to find their level. What I wanted to emphasize, however, was that the maritime people were quite willing to take Islam and gradually have Islam more or less take over from all the remnants of Indic civilization in maritime Southeast Asia. But on the mainland, just the opposite. Islam made no headway. Buddhism, which is really a part of the Hindu realm and was no more important than Hinduism in Southeast Asia before that, Buddhism was kept as the religion of the people. Hinduism basically disappeared, replaced by Buddhism, of course basically in the same Indic tradition. But it's quite interesting that the people that selected Buddhism, and for various reasons, they developed their own version of Theravada Buddhism, which is somewhat different from the Buddhism that was left behind in India or the Buddhism that went to East Asia, the Mahayana Buddhism that went to China, for example. And again, why these things happen and how they influence how people relate to each other, we have no clear record. But again, what it suggests to us, to me anyway, is that in all these societies, as they became more complicated, they seem to have found some way of resolving their disputes without any formal record or formal state decisions here and there. Very few records of that period at all. In fact, when we come to recording these things, I think we only begin to see them with the European companies, particularly with the Dutch East India Company. Even though when the Portuguese first arrived, they were still operating on a different, in a different world. They were still fighting between the Christians and the Muslims. They were like carrying their Mediterranean warfare, as it were, into the Indian Ocean and into Southeast Asia. So the Portuguese are being very Catholic and the Muslims are fighting back. And most of the time they've spent fighting each other. So there's nothing to resolve, there's no disputes. If they saw each other, they would try to kill each other. So that was with the Portuguese and the Muslims. But with the Dutch, they were different. And that's, I think, the beginning of something new. The Dutch, unlike the Portuguese, did not worry about trying to make converts or finding Christians among the Asians. They came here for profit. They were doing business. And after all, they set it up as an East India Company. Their job was to make money for their stakeholders back in Amsterdam or Rotterdam or somewhere. And they were very successful at it. And they were very skilled. And they did their business. Now, this is very interesting. They started to develop very special relationships with the Chinese because they really wanted to trade with China. That's where the money was. Real riches. The richest countries in those days were India and China. And Southeast Asia was relatively poor. Basically native resources and so on. Whereas China had manufacturers which were a tremendous market in Europe. And so the Dutch were aiming at the China market. But they couldn't get in because the Chinese had allowed the Portuguese to develop Macau. And the Chinese let the Macau people, the Portuguese, handle all the trade with Southeast Asia. So the Dutch couldn't get into a special relationship with the Chinese except through the Portuguese, which of course that didn't work at all. The Portuguese didn't let them in, and the Dutch couldn't get the Portuguese to. They were so unfriendly. They were fighting each other anyway in the Straits of Malacca, as you know. Eventually, they got rid of the Portuguese from Malacca. But that was a turning point in some ways, in the sense that in order to deal with the Chinese, they had to learn how the Chinese solved their problems, and they had to offer their European ways of solving their problems. So I believe that historical records suggest for the first time we begin to see a careful recording of how some disputes were settled. We find them in the Dutch records. And we begin, by the 18th century, we find them in Chinese records in Batavia. When the Chinese in Batavia were dealing with the Dutch, they had their own group of people to sort out how to make sure that people don't get cheated and so on. And if there was dispute, then the question of when the Dutch representative and the Chinese representatives met to work it out, they had to find some way. But fortunately, I think in terms of the business involved, both shared the same interest, in the sense that the Dutch wanted to trade with the Chinese, and the Chinese found that trading with the Dutch was the most profitable. So between them, they've had enough common interests, I think, to overcome some of their problems. I'm taking a long time over this, but I thought I should give you the background to say that this whole region seemed to have done very well without mediators, as far as we know. Until it became strictly business between the Dutch and the Chinese. And even then, the record suggests that the two sides were able to resolve their matters, usually by just discussion and so on, because the records show that, at least I don't recall seeing any references to official mediators of any kind. They seem to be able to work it out among themselves, both, as it were, understanding the business interest, the shared business interest, and coming to some kind of compromise as to what needs to be done. At least that seemed to have been how they did it, because they both needed each other's friendship and support and backing for what they were doing. Without the Dutch, the Chinese also had their limits, and without the Chinese, the Dutch couldn't do other things, so they two became quite good partners, you might say. And you might say they developed a certain degree of trust. And this comes back to a word which I think we all realize how important it is. But this part of it, of course, brings out the differences. In the end, the Chinese do have a tremendous philosophical background about the word trust. The European side, the Dutch side, I don't think they use the word trust so much as working out the amount of money involved in negotiations, and they're quite calculating and they're quite realistic about what is possible and what is not. But the idea of trust was never raised, as it were, to a kind of a sacred symbol, as the Chinese did. And so if I may spend a little time on the Chinese, because the Chinese background to this, I would say the Chinese developed the idea within China of mediation very early, among themselves. And this, I thought, I was raising the question whether it's a question of between foreigners that you need mediation. I would say for the Chinese, from way back, it was among themselves. Of course, one has to say that China is a very big country, And people in different parts of China were very different, and they didn't have that much in common. They didn't speak the same dialect. They did not always understand each other. So in a way, within China, for Chinese to deal with other Chinese, it's almost like dealing with foreigners. In a way, if you look at China more like a continent than a country, or as a civilization and a country, it's like talking between the Dutch and the Danes, or the French and the Germans, negotiating with each other. They may come from similar cultural backgrounds, but they don't always understand each other, and they do need mediators. And the Chinese, because it was, and this is quite complicated, it is one state. It was a unitary state by about 3rd century BC. It was over 2,400 years ago now. And once it was a unitary state, it meant that it had central government officials sent out to the whole country. But down below, it was basically an agrarian society. China remained an agrarian society right down, I would say, to the 20th century. In fact, right down to, I would say, 1949, with the communist victory in Beijing, 85 to 90% of the population were peasants in an agrarian society. So in that way, the Chinese were consistently an agrarian society. So their mediation practices were those that were necessary for an agrarian society, in which very few officials were actually involved. Because although the centralized state was created, the centralized states only appointed the top officials, who were given immense powers to deal with a large area, but in which this official would leave a lot to the locals to sort out for themselves. So again, recognizing that in agrarian societies, it's pointless for some high official sent from the capital to deal with local problems. Wisely leave it to the locals to do it. So the Chinese fundamental idea of the family as a basic unit became, I think, the beginnings of this relationship or mediation. It was always between families. As far as the Chinese record shows, it was always between families. Because you heard somebody from another family, your whole family stands with you, the other family stands with the other guy, and then they find a mediator to try and resolve it too. Because the loyalties of the families are absolute on each side. So you cannot, as it were, find a mediator if there are two families involved. You have to find a third guy from a third family to come in. So from the beginning, if families are that powerful, and if families whole are totally loyal to every member of the family, then you have to find a mediator. So I think there are certain basic conditions which it pushed the Chinese to make mediation the normal course of dealing with disputes. Of course, if the two heads of families can sit down and over a cup of wine sort things out, that's simpler still. But most of the time, when it gets a bit more serious than that, then you do need to find a third person to come in and resolve it. And it was so customary, so commonly done, that the official that was sent from the central government, who was the magistrate, called a magistrate or someone, doesn't get involved at all. In fact, on principle, the Chinese system says the local magistrate tells the people, don't come to me, resolve it by yourselves. In fact, find a mediator. Don't bother me. In fact, when you come to bother me, it's because you have failed to find a mediator, or you've been unreasonable and not listened to the mediator's judgment or something like that, and you refuse to accept the judgment, and you come and bother me. So this is right down to the 19th century. This was still so. When the Europeans who arrived, including those interested in law, found what was happening, they found it very amusing that what the magistrate used to do was, when two sides came to him with a problem, he had both sides thrashed first. Because both are guilty of something. You're guilty of not being able to resolve something by yourselves, and you come to disturb me. Because that's not what you're supposed to do. You are supposed to solve it by yourself. That is not what my normal job is as magistrate. This is what the message was. So there are some reports you find in the early East India Company, British East India Company reports, which I've seen. They were extremely amused by this, that this was the way the Chinese magistrate dealt with law, as it were. Don't come and disturb me. And so you can see how this mediation thing was really the standard thing all the way among the Chinese. And it became necessary because when you move from a dispute between two families in a village to the point when you bring your commodities to sell in the cities, and you get into a dispute with a city man who fails to pay you or something like that, the problem arises. So essentially, as the society gets more complicated, and urban societies with larger and larger groups of merchants develop, then mediation becomes more and more complicated, and something becomes more formal. And you can see the difference between how the peasants, agrarian society, find mediators, but in the towns, between merchants, that's much more difficult. It comes back to the simple thing that when merchants deal with other merchants, most of the time you're dealing with someone you don't know very well, and you have to depend on various things. One thing is you depend on a group of people who support you. For example, in your line of business, all those people who come from the same province, trading in another city, you group together and you support each other against another merchant who comes from another part of the country. You organize yourself differently. And the sophistication of all this developing in China was really quite amazing. And as the merchants and the cities grow, they become more and more sophisticated. Different groups form your Huiguan or your She or your Gongxi or whatever it is. And sometimes you call it secret societies, which are people whom you trust. A brotherhood of a group of people who swear allegiance and loyalty to one another. Then each of these groups then essentially solve their problems with one another. If you don't fight each other, you have to find somebody to come in. You don't want to fight each other, you find somebody to resolve it. But of course, very often it fails, and they do fight. Even in Singapore, in the 19th century, there were fights between secret societies and brotherhoods, and we have detailed records of how they fought. And that was because they couldn't find a mediator. They had to resolve it only by fighting. But most of the time, they would try to do it through their associations, through a temple association, a hometown association, any way of grouping. You have same surname, same town, same dialect group. You find some way so that you have a family outside of your village. Among strangers, you can find somebody who can help you. Behind it all, however, while all this was done on the ground, practical ways of dealing with it, the philosophers, people like Confucius and all the thinkers in the past, already tried to develop an idea of how these kinds of problems should be resolved. And they developed the idea that, and the upper class people, who didn't like any of these things at all. They liked to handle it between scholars, between gentlemen, between aristocrats or whatever. Among themselves, they would have unspoken rules of how to behave. And so morality, concept of trust began to evolve. And then you have philosophical treatises about trust. But this was very much at a higher level, highly abstract and very idealistic. It took a long time before it penetrated down to the lower levels. It was not until, in fact, I would say, the Song dynasty, after 2,000 years of Confucian ideas and so on, before the merchant classes of China were persuaded that this was something that they should adopt. And if they adopted it, those mandarins who looked down on them would at least treat them with some respect if they developed the idea of trust and practiced it. And once it was accepted and the merchant class began to bring up their children or the people who they're training in business to seriously understand the need to trust each other by being always keeping to your word. If you make a promise, you deliver and never fail. And the moment you fail, your reputation is gone and you lose your business altogether. Nobody trusts you and you're out. So if you cultivate that systematically, it is possible for the whole community of merchants to actually trust each other to the extent that over the dinner table, I give you my word, I shall deliver X amount of goods to you on such and such a day. You can count on it. And then you don't need a mediator. You just do that. So this high Confucian ideal, which came down into when it was in practice, it worked up to a point. And it was, in fact, I was very struck to see some of the Dutch records praising the Chinese for being trustworthy. If they give you their word, it will be done. Because they among themselves, it is so strong. If you don't deliver, you fail to do that, your reputation is down, and everybody discards you, will not trade with you or deal with you thereafter. Now, that is more punishment than any law firm or law court can give, because you're finished as a businessman once you lose other people's trust. So it became very serious. And certainly by the time you come to Singapore, when Singapore was developed and more Chinese came, and in fact they outnumbered everybody else within 50 years, there were more Chinese merchants in Singapore than anybody else. Then it was among the Chinese that this had to work. But because they came from very different backgrounds, ranging from those who are the children of Peranakans, Babas, for several generations, to those who newly come from a village in China, the range is so great, it was difficult to build that trust because they were not settled. Successful merchants can be trusted. If you're successful, I believe that you're successful because you've been trustworthy all your working life. That's why you're successful. So I can trust you. But if you're nobody, starting as a laborer and trying to work yourself up and work hard and trying to do business, it's not, you cannot take for granted anybody will trust you. You have to prove it. And this is not that easy. So there were moments when it didn't work, and you need mediator. And that, again, then you find them doing the same thing as in China. They set up their associations, their secret societies, brotherhoods, and so on to sort things out. But eventually, the problem had to be faced, that they were not only dealing with among themselves, they were also dealing with the Europeans. And as the British agency houses grew and became more and more absorbed into trading with the Chinese, all over Southeast Asia, not only in Singapore, but wherever they went, then the question of law became significant. Because law was what the Europeans did among themselves, but it was only among themselves. I mean, you read the early parts of Singapore history, you find that, well, Penang, Malacca, the Straits settlements, law was only among the Westerners. Frenchmen, maybe a German or an Englishman, a Dutchman, they may disagree. They had to go to law. But the Chinese were not involved, very rarely involved. Gradually, they were involved. But the turning point, when did the Chinese find that they had to do it? When they had to deal with the Europeans, and the Europeans say, well, we must go to the law, then they had to move into a different sphere. I was always curious to know why it took so long for the Chinese in Singapore to want to study law. There weren't many people signing up for legal studies. I could find, in fact, the earliest Singapore-born Chinese who studied law was a chap in Hong Kong. He went to Hong Kong and he studied law called Wu Tianfang, his name. He was called Ng Choi. He was born in Singapore, but he went to Hong Kong and eventually he went to study law. And he, as far as I know, he was the first to study law as such. And for Singapore, there may have been earlier ones, but I haven't been able to check that very well. But the first significant legal figure was Song Wong Xiang, who wrote a lot about it. He was very highly respected, and so on. But he was a Queen's scholar, studying in England, coming back, and right at the end of the 19th century. And as far as I know, he was the first successful, as it were, and respected by the British too, as a lawyer. And they didn't actually allow a faculty of law to develop in Singapore until 1956, Now, that's a long, long time after decolonization. In other words, as long as the Straits Settlement was a colony of the British, there was never training of lawyers, at least no proper training of lawyers in Singapore, which goes to show that the demand was not that great from the people of Singapore. And on the government side, they felt, well, you want to study law, you go to England. That's the only place you can learn law properly. We can't teach you law here. You have to go there. You can see there are gaps in even trusting each other on how much law to study. It took a long while. I was always amazed that the Faculty of Law took so long to develop here and how people have to go a long, long way to study law. Even though it was increasingly clear by the beginning of the 20th century that more and more Chinese were turning to the law. Not only in dealing with the Westerners, of course, that they had to do it, but even among Chinese, it was very rare that they would go to the law. They would, again, solve it among themselves, socially, among the organizations, and so on. So all of this suggests how difficult it has been for this region, with all those centuries of civilizational contacts with the Indic, the Islamic, the Chinese, even the Christian and the Europeans. It took so long before we took up the idea of law seriously. So in a society without law, what else have we got except some kind of mediation? It may take different forms, and different societies may practice it differently, but the ingenuity of human beings is incredible. They always find ways and means of solving disputes when there's no formal structure to doing so. But what we're talking about is that until the 20th century, I would say, it was still probably more normal for Chinese businessmen to find mediators among themselves or depend on each other's trustworthiness to do business than to go to the law. So it's a fairly recent thing. And why that difficulty? And this comes back to probably the most important concept that we face today, and that is the nature of law itself. I mean, I know you all are practicing. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm really not qualified to say this. But as a historian, the fact that law is understood so differently in the way it developed in Europe from Roman law, in fact, that's 2,000 years of legal history, and even that evolving in all sorts of complicated ways from Roman law to the common law, from the administrative law to the common law, been all kinds of different variations. But in Asia, there were no systems of law as such. Everybody used the word law here and there. And the Chinese, for example, had the word fa long, long time ago. We talk about the legalists in China. They were very serious about law. But their idea of law is very straightforward. Their idea of law is that the emperor makes a law because it's only through law can they control the society. Because the threat of using the law would be a deterrent against crime, against dishonesty, against all those people out there who are threatening the social harmony. You need law. So the emperor passes a lot of laws. And when the Chinese empire was united for the first time, the founder of this Chinese empire was a legalist. He had a bunch of legalists advising him. And he had a set of very elaborate laws drawn up. And they were very harsh. The punishment was almost invariably being badly beaten to death or executed directly immediately after judgment is passed. And they didn't waste time on it, and they didn't spend too much money on solving problems either. And very harsh. So they had law all that time. When the Romans had their law, the Chinese already had their law. Very serious. But that dynasty didn't last long, followed by the Han dynasty. And one of the reasons why it didn't last long was the punishments caused a lot of unhappiness among the people. And the rebellions against the state were so great that the dynasty fell. And the successor dynasty learned the lesson. You may have the law, but don't apply it too strictly. So what they did was eventually the Han Dynasty brought in the Confucians, who didn't believe in the law. As I mentioned to you, this is really morality. What we need to do is educate you to be good, to be moral, to be honest, to always keep your word, and so on, and build up trust. Law, Confucius actually said it. He did actually explicitly say, law is a bad thing, because once you have law, you will have disputes all the time. Everybody will go to disputes, and nobody will be bothered to be good. Because you can always take it to a law and solve it by have it legally sorted out. And you have long lists of disputes, and everybody will be having disputes against everybody else. So Confucius' idea was warn against using the law, but educate good people, then you don't need the law. At least you minimally need as little as possible. So the Han Dynasty brought in the Confucians to administer an empire which was built on law, harsh laws, and basically came to a compromise. The laws remained, they were never removed, but the Confucians did not practice it. I was reminded of this very recently in Singapore to say that they leave the law there but never apply it. So that was in a way very Confucian. That's exactly what the Confucians did. They did not change the laws. They kept them there. In fact, those laws were reproduced dynasty after dynasty. The Tang Dynasty enlarged upon it. The Ming Dynasty had a fantastic set of laws. But the Confucian Mandarin, as I gave you examples, the magistrate said, don't come to see me. Solve it yourself. He wanted to avoid using the law, if you can possibly avoid it. And so that was the compromise. Have the laws there as deterrent, warning what could happen, but use it sparingly. Avoid using if you possibly can, and all the time lecture to you how to be good, moralize, and continually nag you about being good and trustworthy so that you don't bother the magistrate and don't go to the law. That compromise worked for 2,000 years, because basically that compromise remained right up to the 19th century, 20th century. And that is what the Europeans, in the Treaty of Nanjing after the Opium War, that was really what it was about. We talk about it in terms of the opium. The opium was really just an excuse. The real struggle was the fact that the British traders arriving in China, unlike the Dutch who were willing to compromise, the British traders by that time, they were very powerful. East India Company had been taken over by the British state by the time of the Opium War. In 1837, East India Company was folded up, and the British government took over everything that the East India Company had. And they took the view that trade and everything must be according to the law. How can we trade otherwise? And their complaint against China was, we are trading, but you don't have any law. But the Chinese says, yes, we do. We have law, even though we use it in a different way. But that was not satisfactory. And the British argued against the Chinese way of doing things without success. And in the Treaty of Nanjing, and even more so in the Treaty of Beijing, this was spelled out in the way they introduced something called extraterritoriality, which you've all heard of. It meant that in the treaty ports of Shanghai, Fuzhou, Tianjin, and other places, and the treaty ports expanded to something like 50 or 60 of them eventually. In each of them, when the foreigner is involved, Chinese law doesn't apply. If a foreigner is involved, the European law applies, whether it's French, Swiss administrative law or British common law. So whenever a foreigner is involved, Chinese law doesn't apply. Essentially saying, and this comes out in the literature incidentally, to say that your law is uncivilized. Only our law is civilized. And this is incidentally the real reason why the Chinese feel humiliated. Not because they were defeated many, many times. That they're used to that. They were defeated by Mongols, Manchus. Being defeated in war is nothing to be ashamed of. But being told that you're uncivilized because your law is lousy and simply doesn't work, and we absolutely reject it. We will not subject our people to it. And they went to war several times for it. The Treaty of Nanjing was the first one. A set of laws down to the Treaty of Beijing when they actually took over Beijing and all the way up to the Boxers. Each step of the way, they were emphasizing the treaty port must continue with extraterritoriality. And the Chinese fought against that to the point when, by the beginning of the 20th century, they reformed their legal system. They actually sent their experts to Europe to study the administrative law, but they chose administrative law instead of common law. They went to Switzerland and France to take their laws, modify them a little bit, and introduce a whole set in China in about 1904 onwards. And they had trained a whole bunch of Chinese legal experts to practice that law. And then when they did all that, of course the revolution took place, the Manchu dynasty fell, but the Republic reaffirmed the law and continued to apply that. And what they were trying to do all that time was to say that we now have the law, get rid of the extraterritoriality clause in the treaties. And the British refused. So all that time, and this, I can tell you, this is what the Chinese were humiliated about. The fact that they were still considered uncivilized because the British would not take up the extraterritoriality clause, and they continued to practice it, believe it or not, until 1943, when in the middle of the Second World War, the Americans and the British finally agreed that since we're allies fighting the Japanese together, maybe it's about time we took that clause out. And so then that was finally taken out in 1943. I give you this example to show that this question of law between the Chinese and the West remains a problem today. And you can see where it comes from, deep down, the Chinese attitude towards law and the European attitude towards law. I think it has something to do with the fact that the Western idea of law did derive from the idea of a natural law. It's God's law. You might say it was the Ten Commandments kind of background, that this is sacred and it's God's law and everybody has to pay attention to the law. It's not the emperor's law, not just a man in power who determines the law. It's God's law. Even the emperors are subject to the law, as the various rulers in Europe found themselves being excommunicated by the Pope or something like that, because it's God's law, and even the king is subject to the law. And that idea makes the law so sacred, and whether they liked it or not, they evolved the law in such a way that it became more and more acceptable to ordinary man, became more and more practiced as everybody is equal before the law. That principle took a long time to evolve, went to many, many stages, but that is a fundamental principle which the Chinese adopted when they had the laws changed at the beginning of the 20th century. But in effect, the underlying principle behind it was not fully understood by most people, because the society's whole historical background has been that the law is man-made, is made by the state, and the people are subject to that law, but not the state itself. Which today, of course, means the Chinese Communist Party is the emperor. They make the law, and they're above the law. And if you look at the situation in China, that is still the case. Well, rightly or wrongly, what they say is that the Communist Party determines if you're guilty, if your party member breaks the law, they have to decide first whether he's guilty or not. If he's guilty, he's sacked from the party before he goes to the judge. So he's already proven guilty by the party before he goes to the court. So you can imagine what the judgment would be like. So you can see these traditions still continues. So even to this day, the idea that law is somehow sacred, God-given, and everybody, including rulers and political leaders, are subject to the law, and those who say, but not the state itself or whoever is in power, because he made the law, therefore he's exempted from the law. That's a very fundamental difference. And this, I think, remains the problem today. I mean, when you look at the arguments even about trade and so on, most of it really stems from this disagreement about who actually makes the law. I'm sorry I've taken so long, but I've given you this long background because I can't resist it. Once you start me on this subject of law.
That is fine, Prof. Wang. That is why we have you here today. These are fascinating insights. But you know, as you took us down memory lane or history, you know, there were some common themes that continued to resonate. This idea of shared interests, the idea of trust among peoples, and the fundamental nature of the relationships. No matter how societies organize themselves or came together, there are always these three secret ingredients, as it were, that we find in the mix. Perhaps, Eunice, you could comment on how these characteristics feature in modern mediation theory.
Sure. But first, I would like to just thank Prof. Wang. It's amazing for us to be taken through history like that in just such a short time. We've covered 2,000 years, you know, in just this short time. And just coming back to modern times now and reflecting back on what Prof had shared with us about that most of the time, people could sort out problems by themselves. They did not need to go to the courts, right? And today, when we look back and we think about the role of mediation, in a way, we are trying to encourage people once again to take responsibility for their decisions and to come to an agreement by themselves without having to come to court. Perhaps we need our courts to be more like the courts of old and start trashing people and sending them away. But of course, I joke, because the other angle that Prof. Wang also mentioned was the growing complexity of disputes. So it is not always the same thing that can be done over history and will be effective. And so I think for modern mediators, when we think about what could be useful to encourage people to take responsibility for their disputes, we have to think about it in the modern context, where we have large corporations, where there's a hierarchy within those corporations, and there are incentives as to, you know, responsibility, right? We hear from lawyers very often, and Francis, you could confirm that within corporations, it sometimes is quite hard to persuade a listed company to attempt mediation, because then the responsibility lies on the board for that decision, right? Easier to let it go to court and we accept the decision of the judge. So I think that is a challenge for modern mediation today as to how to once again encourage people to wish to take responsibility for their own disputes.
Thank you, Eunice.
I must confess, I'm very impressed that your mediation center is doing what you're doing today, because although on the surface we have one legal system which is working extremely well in Singapore, the fact is that our plural society and the fact that we encourage people to come to Singapore from all over the world to work here and so on, we actually carry in Singapore alone many traditions of what is trust and what is business and what is how much of the law one should apply and whether or not to go to the law. The people in Singapore alone have come from different traditions. I mean, when I mentioned earlier on the early roots of the society, the indigenous society, what they selected from the Indic, what they selected from the Chinese, what they selected from Islam, and how it is Buddhist in mainland Southeast Asia. All these people are present in Singapore, in fact, all over Southeast Asia. And I was intrigued to learn from tonight from you all that you also deal with state-based people from different countries to mediate between them. So even within a country, there's already so much difference and variety. When you're between countries, different traditions, different heritage, different ideas of what is law. I mean, I suggested the two extreme cases. The Chinese and the Western one, I would say, are the two extreme cases. But there are lots of differences even in between. And how it works with an Islamic group or Indian society, for example. I'm always very struck how the Indians took to British common law so well. And they have done it so well that the courts are absolutely jammed, and things take a long, long time to get resolved, because they all love to go to court and take everybody to the court at a short notice. So they're so successful in applying it now, it's pretty all tied up, knotted up. So that surprised me, because that was not in the Indic tradition whatsoever. But after something like 50 years of the British in the 19th century, the Indians took to the law very, very well. I remember reading by the end of the 19th century, the legal courts were already full. The British were complaining that the Indians were too ready to go to the court. This is even before they left, they were already complaining. So how a culture responds to law, and why it responds to either mediation or adjudication of one kind or the other, I don't know. I mean, I am fascinated. I'm just intrigued. How do you overcome this between different communities in one country and between two different states? I'm, quite frankly, puzzled.
Prof. Wang, thank you. Let's pick your brains a little more. You've shared with us how mainly the Chinese were based on a Confucian system of morality, founded on relationships and trust, whereas the rule of law on the Western side could take two strangers doing business together because they were prepared to submit to this concept of law that binds them together. Can you just comment what was the impact of that kind of a disconnect?
As I said, I don't know specific cases, many of them, but what I've read, I was struck by the fact that even in a country like Hong Kong, a place like Hong Kong or Singapore, the Chinese people took a long time to turn to the law. They didn't immediately see the advantages of the law when the British introduced them. Took a long time and remained quite suspicious of it for a long time, not sure how to operate within it, and preferred their own way of doing things. I mean, even as a young boy, I remember how I've told story after story of business people still operating on the principle of just trust. I give you my word, and he keeps his word because the cost of not keeping his word is so high that he will keep his word. But so that is just a social punishment, and yet it's taken very seriously. But if you're locked out of your business by breaking your word, and you know that, that's strong enough and apparently, as I said, when I was a young boy, I remember still knowing lots of people who did business that way. And I believe it was still done until fairly recently, and probably still being done among some people who can trust each other. So people do, I think, develop trust, and you don't always have to go to the law. And so why people go to the law and why more and more people go to the law is in itself an intriguing question to me as a historian. When you look at thousands of years when there's no law, and people seem to do quite well. they didn't all do that badly. And then suddenly we find everybody wanting to go to the law. I mean, people suing their brothers and sisters and their parents. It's in a Chinese mind, it's pretty unthinkable and utterly amazing that you can develop to that point. Is that what law is supposed to do? You break down in all kinds of other relationships which should have been cultivated. You should cultivate people's idea of being honest, be good, and so on. See, some confusion in me somewhere, and make yourself trusted. If you fail to do that, you are failing yourself. But don't blame the other guy and take him to the court. So I mean, these are some random thoughts that I have.
Can I comment on that?
Please, go ahead,
yeah,
Daphne.
Prof. Wang, I was really, really fascinated to hear your recount of the history of initially people relying on an honor system, a trust, a family system. So I started my legal career and was appointed a magistrate in 1992. And when you were recounting that when people appear before the magistrate, it means that they have failed in mediating or coming to their own solution, that was my first thought. When I joined the courts as a magistrate in 1992, actually at that point in time, we were facing a backlog of cases. So certainly by 1992, the model appears to be that when it comes to dispute resolution, the way people, the framework in which they look at issues is the law. And of course, being a member of the court at that point in time, my mission was to uphold the rule of law. So initially, things were seen from a very legalistic lens, where there's a lot of focus on what are legal rights. And when you look at the multitude of cases before us, initially that was the lens through which disputes were seen. But I must say that very quickly, in the initial years of my legal career, what fascinated me was that was the initial lens, but we seem to have come full circle to going back to what you call the Chinese way of dealing with disputes through mediation. So I recall that at a point in time, mediation was initially used more for small claims cases because it was thought that because of the size of the claim, it does not make sense to put too much time or spend too much legal fees in resolving those matters. So it started off with, when it comes to small claims cases, the registrar of the Small Claims Tribunal will actually try to resolve the matter. And I think that was the beginning of the courts going into alternative dispute resolution through mediation. And so it seems to me that we went full circle. And then after that, when we set up the family court, it was also thought that the adversarial system, which is what the litigation court system is essentially, can be very damaging for the parties, in particular for family litigants or parents who, despite the family dispute, would have to continue to deal with each other as parents, at least until the children attain adulthood. So it began with the court trying to persuade people to go for mediation because there wasn't court-mandated mediation that is backed up by the law. So when we first started the family court, actually, we appointed mediators, but because there wasn't backing of the law, at that point in time, I was the registrar of the family court. My role was to pick appropriate cases and try to persuade the family litigants to go for mediation. That proved to be very, very successful. And by today, the law has been amended such that the courts can direct parties to go for mediation, or for that matter, counseling to resolve their disputes. And from there, we now, even when it comes to commercial disputes, we have got the Singapore Mediation Center. The courts can also refer parties either for mediation at the Singapore Mediation Center or to the mediation unit within the court. So I thought it was fascinating as I listened to you, take us through the history of dispute resolution in this part of the world, that when it came to Singapore, certainly by the time I joined the legal profession, litigation is initially the primary means to resolve disputes, but with the court taking, I think, quite a leading role, it drove changes to getting parties and building a whole legal system to introduce alternative dispute resolution to the system. So we seem to have come one full circle. And then if you want me to comment on the international law scene, I think that's even more fascinating. But let me hand the floor back to Francis.
Thank you, Daphne. So, Prof, taking Daphne's cue, can you tell us a bit about the situation in the role of the state, versus the role of the individual, and then the relationships perhaps between state to state? Some comments from you.
I can't say that I know how to define the exact relationship, but what I find interesting is that the modern state takes on a lot more than the traditional state. This is a very recent thing. Most governments dealt very lightly on social and cultural matters. They left it to the society and other organizations to deal with. Today, we actually talk about the state being responsible for more and more things. And it began really, I would say, in the 19th century. In a funny sort of way, it was the source of the quarrel between capitalism and socialism. That's where it began. That capitalism didn't care enough, and the socialists are arguing that the state should take on more, control the capitalists too. The state should control the capitalists and look after the welfare of the people. So gradually you had the idea of the welfare state and the socialism getting rid of the capitalists altogether and distributing all the wealth among the poor. And so all these ideological arguments came up because capitalism had brought to the surface so many of the differences. The rich and poor differences, the inequalities became more and more obvious. And the sense of injustice, social injustice, grew among populations, particularly in Britain, because they were the leaders in the Industrial Revolution, and capitalism really developed first in Britain before elsewhere. And you can see the rise of socialism. You take the early history of the kind of social consciousness and against slavery, and then again in the trade unions and so on, and the gradual growth of socialist ideas. I mean, after all, even Karl Marx had to work in the British Museum to get his idea of communism, of socialism. It was out of studying capitalism in Britain that gave him the idea that the world needed socialism and communism. And so it has linked to that. And what has happened is that each step of the way, people are expecting the government to do more. Because as the governments took on more, because they wanted to make sure that everything is fair, they make sure that the capitalists don't get too much and the poor people don't get too left behind. They took away the work from what had been previously the work of voluntary groups, maybe religious groups, philanthropic groups and so on, who actually did all that without the state being involved. But now they said that's not good enough. If you depend on donations from greedy capitalists who will never give you a dime, as it were, that was the image you got from the propaganda of that time. You have to do something. The state must be responsible. That idea of the state being responsible for more and more, I hate to say this, but has grown bigger and bigger. I would say today, we expect the state to do far more than anybody ever dreamed the state should have to do. In most countries in the world, my impression is that civil servants have grown in number as a proportion of working people doing the work of the state. It may be a good thing. They do a lot of good work, and I'm not decrying that. The consequences of that is that people take less and less responsibility for what they themselves do. Because you can say, well, this is something that the state should be doing. Why should I worry about it, But I can see that the state, like Singapore, which took on a lot to begin with, also is realizing that. And you can see in the last 2 years with the pandemic and so on, the state is wavering between how much the state should do and how much it should get the population involved in caring and taking on the kind of work that should have been done in the past, would have been done normally, but now have to be virtually encouraged and prodded prodded by the state to go and do more and rewarded. The state actually now rewards people for caring so that the state doesn't have to do it. You have to encourage people to do it. So this is a kind of recognition that the balance has gone wrong and the state should not be taking on so much. But at the same time, I'm not sure that people have lost that sense that the state should be doing something more. Always blame the state, or why isn't the state doing this? Why isn't the government doing this? And that is actually very, very commonly, I've heard that so often myself. And I do remember there was one period when I was more socialistic minded. I too said, why doesn't the state do this? But then I've realized that there's a limit to what the state can do and should do. We shouldn't ask the state to do too much because you don't want the state to do everything. And if you look at the state, some states today, the state are trying to do everything, control everything. And that actually makes for a very bad society, to my mind. The society doesn't take responsibility for itself. It passes on the duty to the state, leaves it to the civil service and so on, civil servants. And that's not right. That doesn't seem to be right. Could go back to this question of law, which is, to me, important. I actually believe in the rule of law as opposed to the rule by law, which is a distinction which some people don't bother with, and probably doesn't, in reality, not so clear-cut. But in fact, if you intellectually try to separate the two, there is one big difference in that. When it's ruled by law, you are really acting like legalists. You go by the law, everything by the law, and you don't worry whether it's good or bad. If the law says so and you break the law, you're punished. Rule of law, I like to believe, rule of law has built into it a sense of morality. In other words, the sense of justice comes from a sense of morality. What is good or bad, what is right or wrong, is a moral judgment, and you're cultivating, you should be cultivating that feeling, that ability to tell what is good or wrong. At least you sense something is right or wrong or good or evil without having the law tell you what you can and cannot do. And if rule of law, if I'm right in believing the rule of law incorporates with itself and should be emphasizing more, is the moral basis on which the rule of law works. That the rule of law doesn't work if you don't teach people morality. And in the end, the moral feeling of what is right and wrong and good and evil that every individual has a bit of and should be encouraged to have more, if that doesn't function, then, like it or not, you end up with rule by law. Rule of law is meaningless. In the end, you just go by rule by law. And I think if you end up like that, then in the end, of course, everything goes to the courts. Nothing can be resolved because you don't really trust anybody anymore. You just let the courts decide. Let everything go to the courts. And I think that would be a great pity.
Thanks, Prof. Wang. So back to you, Daphne. You wanted to comment about the role of the state, perhaps in the light of what Prof. Wang has been sharing. How does that gel in the modern context?
Well, Prof, I agree with you that when it comes to the modern state, there's an expectation that the government does regulate for the public good. So earlier when I made the comments about the place of mediation, what I had in mind was that, in fact, it's the other way. Businesses now sometimes feel that the government has regulated too much. For example, if we pass laws on, say, for public health reasons, take, for example, tobacco control measures, it may impact some businesses, and their perception is that that is something which is because of the adverse impact on their business. These days, they can actually take on the government through what we call investor state claims. So when you talk about the feeling that has the government, been regulating too much, I think there's a certain expectation, but when we do that, we can be confronted with challenges. And if we had time, I wanted to also spend a bit of time talking about whether there's a place for mediation for such matters. Yeah, so actually that was what I was referring to.
Okay. All right, there's a lot of good feedback coming through in the questions. One of the attendees says, great feedback, I'm learning a lot, thank you very much. Some other comments as well, which I will summarize this way. You know, Prof, you were mentioning about how the role of the magistrate in the past was, don't bother me, you know, go and solve the matter yourself. We now have the modern iteration in our Rules of Court Order 5, which basically says parties have a duty to consider amicable resolution of the matters, either before proceedings, during proceedings, or before an appeal. So perhaps, Prof. Wang, thank you. What you've shared with us today helps us understand our modern rules of court a little better. Perhaps
well, going back to the past.
Unspoken signal is, you know, mediate more, solve your problems, and bother us less. All right? And then the response here is that we have been training more mediators, upskilling the mediators, ensuring quality. And I think the golden age of mediation is still for us to grasp. You know, so I think we have run out of time. Prof, thank you for being with us today. Eunice and Daphne, thank you for sharing your insights.
Francis, if I may, just one
Please,
final thing.
Squeeze in
one more
the
thing.
insight.
And that's because I know there's many lawyers in the room as well. And I thought another lesson we can draw from Prof. Wang is his reference to morality as the alternative to law. And maybe as lawyers, it is time for us to think about, as good moral lawyers, you know, what is the best way that we should advise clients, right, to encourage them to take personal responsibility for their disputes, and whether lawyers have any role in that, right? Maybe something just to think about for lawyers. And the last thing I wanted to also just mention is that the Singapore Mediation Centre, when it was first set up, the idea behind it was to allow people to solve their problems in a less costly process in terms of time, money, and more importantly, relationships. This came from our former Chief Justice, Yong Pang Hao. And he also mentioned that alternative dispute resolution was more desirable, especially in the context of an Asian society which stresses harmony and cohesiveness. So these are some moral concepts being brought in as well. And so I just wanted to give a shout out to SMC for the good work they are doing. And I hope that all of us can continue to support the work of SMC as well.
Thank you, Eunice. On your point of lawyers, I think to the lawyers in the room and those who are listening in, the rise of mediation doesn't necessarily mean the death of lawyers or the death of legal practice. If you were listening closely to what Prof. Wang was sharing, he was saying that in our historical state, in our natural state, it was the common business interests or the common interests, the trust and the relationships that were at the heart and core. So I think it's time now for us lawyers to reflect. What are we serving? Or who are we serving? What is the best interest of our client? And I think as you recalibrate yourself, you will find that the wave of mediation that is coming upon us is really a time to practice with greater conscience and with greater heart. So with that, Prof. Wang, thank you so much for spending your time with us. We wish it was 3 hours of the lecture, but we have to end now. And Eunice and Daphne, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for being with us. Thank you very much.
Yes, let's give a warm round of applause for our speakers today. It's truly been a privilege to listen to you share your insights. If everybody could remain seated just for the time being, We would like to present you with some tokens of our appreciation. We'd like to invite Mr. Philip Fong to the stage. All right, round of applause for Mr. Francisco. And Ms. Daphne Hong. Professor Gungwu. And Ms. Eunice Chua. All right, we'd like to invite to the stage Justice Belinda Ang and Rama Tiwari, the Chief Executive of the Singapore Academy of Law, for a photo-taking session. It's just one photo, it's not really a session. All right, that brings us to the end of the Singapore Mediation Lecture 2022. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us, whether you're here in person or online. If you're here in person, please feel free to join us outside for a reception. And remember to check out if you're claiming CPD points. For those of you online, hopefully you can join us in person next time. See you all again soon.